both to pick up what they say.
Pick it up really well. I actually recorded my whole so I just know it's an odd thing, but actually helped much campus.
We're not quite starting on time, but almost starting on time. You're very welcome to Dublin Castle to the 13th Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade NGO Forum on Human Rights. We have a very interesting program today, and you're all extremely welcome. The most important people in the room are not the people up here, with all due respect, but you, the participants. and we hope for a lively question and answer session this morning. My name is Colin Rafter. I'm the head of the Human Rights Unit in the Department of Foreign Affairs. If you have any questions or if you need assistance, please ask one of my colleagues. They're all wearing yellow badges. They know everything. You will notice that I'm not wearing a yellow badge, that's because I know nothing. I'm going to hand over now, before I go, I should mention that the two exits are just here to my right and at the end of the room where most people come in. I'm going to hand over now to the moderator for the first panel, Ambassador Patricia O'Brien, who is the permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations in Geneva and also to the other international organisations in the Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. So, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, and ladies and gentlemen, it's an honour and a privilege to serve as moderator of this first plenary panel of the Forum, Human Rights and Foreign Policy, reconciling human rights and political, economic and development interests. International human rights law exists, as we all know, not in a vacuum, but in the real world, a complex and interconnected world of sometimes competing political, economic and development interests. Indeed, human rights principles increasingly serve as the language in which politics and legitimacy are now expressed. This panel seeks to explore the relationship between these interests and human rights in contemporary foreign policy. Ireland's investment in its membership of the Human Rights Council is, I think, a clear expression of the centrality of human rights to our political outlook and a reflection of the efforts to mainstream human rights within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. This forum is timely in view of the recently initiated process of reviewing our foreign policy, which will analyse our human rights policy and the impact in a complex and changing international environment. This is a process to which our discussion today, we think, will inevitably contribute hugely, and we're hoping so. Ireland endeavours to maintain strong linkages between our human rights work at the UN, the EU and other international fora, and our development cooperation programmes. Ireland's new policy for international development, One World, One Future, was published earlier this year, having been the theme for the 12th NGO Forum on Human Rights last year. In this latest policy document, Human Rights and Accountability, it now serves as one of the 6 priority areas for action, a focal point for the planning of our development programme and a recognition of the mutually reinforcing nature of sustainable development and the protection of and realisation of all human rights. In seeking to understand how different interests are reconciled in foreign policy, we might ask ourselves whether human rights must submit to politics, economics and development, or are these interests compatible? How do we walk this tightrope? And furthermore, how does our obligation to respect human rights principles affect our ability to engage with those who do not? Human rights are a universal moral project, but as we regularly see as a member of the Human Rights Council in Geneva and elsewhere, conceptions of how these values should feature in global affairs differ substantially. Is it enough to say that human rights considerations are at the core of foreign policy or a focus of development programs? For this, the commitment needs to be accompanied by concrete action on the international plane, including at the United Nations, the OSCE, and in other international fora. It is fitting that in addressing these questions, we will benefit from a wide range of practical and theoretical perspectives to sharpen our analysis of the place occupied by human rights in foreign policy today. I take this opportunity to introduce now our distinguished panelists who will share their knowledge and experience to make what I think, and I'm sure indeed, will be a challenging, informative, and hopefully productive discussion. So if I may first introduce Ambassador Daniel Baer, here we are, who is the United States representative to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Professor Brendan Sims, to my left, is Professor of the History of International Relations at Cambridge University. Dr. Stephen Humphrey, Senior Lecturer in International Law at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And finally, June Ray, who is the Chief of the Civil Society Section of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. After brief speeches from our distinguished panelists, each for around 7 to 10 minutes, anywhere in that range, we'll open the floor to questions and comments. And we really very much look forward to active participation from you in the discussion which we will have. I do have questions which I myself would like to ask, but I'm hoping not to have to ask a single one, so I'm really hoping that you will engage with the panelists. So thank you very much indeed. Our first speaker is Ambassador Daniel Baer. Just to give you a little bit more background, he's, as I say, the US representative for the OSCE. Before moving to the OSCE, Ambassador Baer was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor in the US State Department. Prior to that, Dr. Baer worked in consultancy and later in academia at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business and the Edmund Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to call on Ambassador Baer to address the forum. Excellency, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Brien. It's really a pleasure to be back here in Dublin. This is a world record for me for a short visit, and there's no place I'd rather have a longer visit, so I'm sorry this is so brief. Obviously, the Irish government has been a great partner to the US government in a number of fora, both bilaterally and also multilaterally, where at the Human Rights Council, even before you took up your membership, we worked very closely together on a range of issues, including the human rights of LGBT people and others in my previous capacity. And so now coming here as the ambassador to the OSCE, I feel like I missed. I had another missed opportunity because I missed the Irish chairmanship, but the legacy of Irish leadership lives on in the OSCE, and so I'm really glad to be here for that reason as well. I thought I didn't actually prepare formal remarks for this because I wanted to try to be more informal and to invite questions, and I have found lately that there are no shortage of questions for U.S. officials speaking on panels, and so I expect that there will be plenty today. But I wanted to, there were some questions in the program that were meant to be, I think, to provoke conversation in this first panel, and I wanted to actually take those 3 questions in turn and just say 1 or 2 minutes about each, and then offer a few observations at the end. So the first question that was in our program was, and Ambassador O'Brien just repeated a version of it, is what are the complexities of reconciling ideals with political, economic, and development interests in the daily reality of foreign policy and practice? And I'm really grateful for these questions because I hear echoes of them in different places as I travel. And I guess I would say there's no need to reconcile our ideals, which we really, when we say ideals, we should say our human rights policy objectives, because it makes no sense to actually hold an ideal if you don't actually see it as an objective to see that ideal brought into practice. But our human rights policy objectives and our political, economic, and development objectives don't need to be reconciled. The world has provided us in recent years with a number of examples that show that places where human rights are routinely and regularly repressed are only stable until they're not. And to assume that our political objective is a peaceful world, those states both cause challenges to peace and stability for themselves and for their neighbors. The only reliable formula for long-term peaceful coexistence is a community of democratic rights-respecting states that live in harmony. And so human rights is completely compatible and doesn't need to be reconciled with that political objective. In terms of economic objectives, I'll say one on the negative and one on the positive. Everywhere I go in the developing world, the single biggest problem that people point to in terms of an economic challenge is corruption. And it is absolutely astounding to me how few tools we have that have successfully addressed corruption. There isn't a standalone policy tool that has successfully addressed corruption. The only formula that has successfully addressed corruption is the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms so that journalists and civil society can do the job that they do in helping use sunshine as the best disinfectant and advance the fight against corruption. On the affirmative side, there's been a great deal of conversation about the power and potential of the internet to serve as a platform for economic growth in the years ahead. And indeed, all of the analyses show that in the EU and in the United States, the internet will continue to be a platform for economic growth over the next decade, and a larger share of that. But the power of the internet is derived from the reduction of transaction costs on information. And one of the things that does is it helps us build innovation economies. It allows us to exchange. But that can't be preserved if we don't preserve fundamental freedoms and human rights online as we do offline, because the internet would then become something that isn't maximally providing for the exchange of information that fuels innovation and allows economic growth. And in terms of development, I take development to be those things related to the first two, but not maybe fully captured, but the providing people with the things that they need in order for what we recognize as human flourishing. I think a great deal of work has shown, both in the academic sphere by people like Amartya Sen, as well as in the political sphere, that human rights should be an objective of development, and that human rights progress reinforces sustainable development progress. And so none of these goals are things that need to be reconciled or in somehow in tension with human rights. Human rights is the long-term strategy for all of these. The rest is just tactics, and I think it's in tactics that we run into challenges. And the second question is, our ideal that was put to us is, are ideals and interests regarded as compatible in practice, and how is this complex relationship managed? So here as well, the challenge that we have is we are human, and we don't always take the long-term strategy and translate it as well as possible into short-term tactics. And we also have unpredictable events that come up that challenge. We know that human progress is not linear. And so I think the challenge that we have is a very practical one, to keep in mind the long-term strategy and to be honest with ourselves and try to translate that as effectively as possible as we can into tactics. But this is not a balancing act. Human rights are central to the interests of every society. It's not balancing our ideals against interests. Human rights are in the interest of every society, including those that have autocratic leaders that deny them. They are still central to the interests of that society. Maybe not to that autocratic leader, but to that society, they are still central. And I think they're often not regarded as such because we've gotten so used to the starting point being negotiating with an autocratic leader that we end up negotiating with ourselves. We're so used to moving the whims of autocratic leaders that we start negotiating with ourselves even before we've had clear thinking. The third question we had was, how best can states which have traditionally embraced human rights norms engage with emerging powers which have not? And I guess I would like to kind of throw out that question, because I think it builds in several assumptions that aren't comfortable to me. The first is the idea that there are kind of traditional states for whom human rights is part of their tradition. I know that it sounds probably heretical for an American, given how often we talk about the fact that human rights are the center of American constitutional democracy, et cetera, to say this, but I think we should not see human rights as a status that one group has. First of all, some of the states that lead most on human rights today, where this week is the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and Angela Merkel grew up in East Germany. Germany is a strong voice in many areas around the world on human rights. I mean, what counts as a tradition? 20 years. Does that count as a tradition? Let's not get into this idea that there's some kind of a great cultural divide where human rights are a tradition of some states and not others. I think we shouldn't see this as a conversion project. I think at the same time, the other reason why seeing it as a permanent status is not helpful is that it's always, in every state, an ongoing project. It's not like you get human rights and then kind of sit back and work on other things. It's a constant process. And the idea that there's some states who have traditionally, embraced this and others who haven't, it hides the fact that it's a constant project even in those states that I think people are thinking of when they say the states that have embraced it. It also overlooks the fact that people everywhere are talking about human rights. It doesn't matter that not all governments represent their people, but people everywhere. And so to write off the citizens of states whose governments have not, quote, embraced human rights is a grave error. And I think, when you look at the blogosphere in China or the conversations that people are having or the new citizens movement and some of the very interesting civil society activities that are going on in China, people are talking about human rights everywhere in China. Maybe not always calling it human rights, but they're talking about concepts of fairness, they're talking about openness with regard to governing the environment and their concerns about pollution, all of these things. And we can't write off that group of people merely because their government has a complicated set of perspectives on human rights. So those are the kind of the three questions that were put to us and my responses. I want to conclude by just making a couple points about how human rights politics or human rights foreign policy has changed, I think, or how our perspectives have changed, those of us who are working on it in recent years. And I think there have been a number of shifts. One is the shift from the ideal to the practical. You hear many more pragmatic arguments being made for why human rights is, like the ones that I was making in my response to the first question, for why human rights is central to the practical objectives, what we see as non-idealistic objectives that governments have, whether that is safeguarding investment because through rule of law, or maintaining regional stability by not having repressive governments that are liable to topple at any time, etc. But I think we have to be careful there with that shift, and none of these shifts are complete shifts, but just more kind of expansions. We have to be careful that we should be able to make the principled arguments for human rights. Human rights are good in and of themselves, even if they have practical benefits. And I hear often leaders in many countries starting to talk as if the only reason we pursue human rights is because we get an economic benefit out of it. No, it is consistent with our long-term interests, but it is also consistent with the right and morally defensible way of organizing human society. The second shift is the shift from focusing, we've widened our focus, from focusing entirely on a conversation among governments and engaging and recognizing that this should be principally a conversation with and about peoples. And I think we're making huge progress on that, but there's much more to be done. And we need to watch the way that we talk about foreign policy and about human rights foreign policy, because we can sometimes, in the way that we phrase things, suggest things like the fact that we can be read as suggesting that the Chinese government speaks for the Chinese people on human rights. And that's not the case. And so we should always keep in our mind that this is a conversation chiefly about empowering people, and that one of the outflows of this is that you see more and more people talking about change coming from within, rather than being a bargain that is struck between princes about change from the top. We see long-term human rights, sustainable human rights progress as being part of change coming from within. The third shift is that the local has access to the global. Human rights still, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, begins in the small places close to home, and the most fervent human rights battles remain in the small places close to home. But those local battles are much more able today to participate in a global conversation because of the internet and other changes in our world, are much more able to participate in a global conversation and make use of the norm-setting exercises that happen in multilateral fora as well. And that raises the stakes, frankly, for what we do in multilateral fora and again, raises the stakes on a free and open internet. I think states need to approach human rights foreign policy by building a credible brand for themselves and recognize that human rights diplomacy is something that gives a kind of credibility that money and military power don't buy. I think we should not shy away of talking about real problems in real places. Thematic issues are important to engage with, but human rights challenges happen in real places around the world, and if we're too afraid to talk about the real places, we don't do any help for those people who are on the front lines fighting the local battles. I think we should be very careful to not confuse engagement with compromise. We can engage in a variety of fora with a variety of actors without compromising on principles. And I think we should governments should spend, those of us in foreign ministries, should spend some time thinking about how we can engage internally. Obviously, part of that is that the way that we set an example or don't internally has an effect on our credibility as human rights actors on the international stage. But the other piece of that is that as we begin to make the case in a more pragmatic sense to a range of interlocutors, it's helpful for us in for those of us in foreign ministries to talk to people who are working on environmental protection and international relations related to environmental protection, and talk to them about how do you engage civil society? Here's how can we work together on that, and to really mainstream, in a sense, human rights diplomacy across the range of commercial diplomacy, security diplomacy, other areas where our governments are engaging about, and make sure that we're integrating it as we engage partners. I'll stop there, and we'll look forward to tough questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bear. It's now my pleasure to call on our second speaker, Professor Sims, who's a leading Irish historian of international relations at the University of Cambridge. A fellow of Peterhouse, Professor Sims is a renowned scholar whose publications include Unfinest Hour, Britain and the Destruction of Bosnia, and more recently, Europe, the Struggle for Supremacy, 1453 to the present. Professor Sims is also president of the Henry Jackson Society and chairman of the Project for Democratic Union. Professor Sims, great pleasure. Thank you very much. And you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Brien, for those very kind words of introduction, and I'm very grateful to the department for inviting me. I'm going to address two of the three questions for this panel. First is, are ideals and interests regarded as compatible in practice, and how is this complex relationship managed? And secondly, how best can states which have traditionally embraced human rights norms engage with emerging powers which have not? And given that you're all practitioners, and I'm not, it seemed to me that rather than teaching you to suck eggs, the most useful way for me to add value was to cast some historical light on these questions by reference to the recent and more distant past. So the first question, how best to engage with emerging powers on these issues? And I think here what we're confronted with is a problem of a perception of asymmetry and double standard. So the narrative, as it were in the South, is that the West has pursued historically a policy of Westphalian state sovereignty, insisting on the entitlements of state sovereignty until, roughly speaking, the 1990s, when you had the development of the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, and this idea of state sovereignty was revised in order to shut out the South. So in other words, the West made the rules, and then we changed them through RTP and other devices. And this narrative, this rhetoric, is accompanied by the view that intervention is something that the quote West does to the quote South. The point I want to make is that, in truth, the whole idea of Westphalian sovereignty is historically an illusion. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which brought to an end the 30 Years' War, was in fact predicated on the assumption that German princes could not do within their own territories what they wanted, because to do so would cause confessional war and would bring the whole house down in the European state system. And therefore the Treaty of Westphalia laid down, actually, religious rights for minorities and more particularly, it actually permitted outside intervention to enforce those rights. And those rights were not simply religious, but also political. Just to give you one example, in the early 18th century, the German Empire intervened against the ruler of Mecklenburg in northern Germany on the grounds that he was abusing his power against his own subjects, his own nobility. And the argument for this was that the failure to do so would create instability in northern Germany and suck in outside powers, in that particular case, Russia. Another example would be the campaign against slave trade, which begins as a unilateral British measure, becomes a European consensus in the course of the early 19th century, involves a massively intrusive regime of inspections, and only later is then applied to non-Western actors, particularly Africa. So the point I'm trying to make in this first part of my remarks is that there's very little that the West in the past has done to the South that it didn't already do to itself. So there's actually no inconsistency or double standard here. There's progress, but not, I think, inconsistency or double standards. So the second question, are ideals and interests compatible in practice? Now, of course, this tension has a long history in the study of international relations. It goes back to the early modern idea of a raison d'etat, or 19th century conceptions of realpolitik, this idea that there is some sort of pure national or state interest which is separable from ideological factors such as human rights or constitutional entitlements. And I'll skip the bit where I say that this is historically not true, because it's been very much an axiom, certainly of British and US foreign policy, that the rights of the constitutional rights abroad, human rights abroad, are also part of a broader national security concern. But let me focus simply on the more recent past. Taking the case of Bosnia, Ambassador O'Brien mentioned, I wrote a book called On the Finest Hour on Britain and the Destruction of Bosnia. And here the initial British government stance was very much a realpolitik position, saying that whatever was happening in Bosnia with ethnic cleansing, displacements of hundreds of thousands, the deaths of tens of thousands, this was not a matter of national concern, national interest, that the humanitarian and the strategic could be separated. But in fact, as I think I showed in the book, what happened in Bosnia, the human rights abuses, ethnic cleansing, very quickly became an issue of credibility for the broader structures, the European Union, but particularly also for NATO. And in the end, intervention was required, simply because continuing genocide in Europe was in fact incompatible with the stability of the continent and the credibility of its major security institutions. We see the same phenomenon in the Middle East over the last decades. Pre-2001, Western policy, particularly United States policy in the Middle East, was based on a realpolitik conception of keeping in place repressive regimes which, in inverted commas, delivered on security interests. And of course, the events of 2001 showed that this policy did not deliver, that in fact repressive states generate and export instability, particularly in the case of Saudi Arabia. We see this again in the course of the Arab Spring, where I think I agree with Ambassador Baer that we saw once again that repressive states deliver stability until they don't. And the contagion, if you like, of revolt across North Africa, first of all in Gaddafi, or secondly in Gaddafi, starting in Tunisia, then of course in Gaddafi's Libya. Again, post-rapprochement, Gaddafi had been brought on side, as it were, through negotiations and engagement, but in fact was unable to control his country. Ditto with Mubarak's Egypt, which admittedly lasted a very long time, but again did not deliver security and stability over the longer term. So, coming back to the question, are ideals and interests compatible in practice? I'm reminded of the German professor who once remarked of an idea, quote, "That is all very well in practice, but it won't work in theory." So my concluding point would be, to be sure, there have been and always will be severe tensions between ideals and interests, especially in the abstract. But in practice, realpolitik has never been enough to secure our interests, and sometimes it is not even very realistic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist, Julie Ray, is the Chief of Civil Society section of UNHCR in Geneva. Prior to taking up this post, she led the OHCHR field presence in the occupied Palestinian territories. She previously worked as an independent consultant and within the NGO sector, specializing in human rights in the Middle East and North Africa, including a decade as Amnesty International's Middle East and North Africa Director. Julie, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador O'Brien, and thank you to our hosts at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for inviting me to join you on this very important occasion. I really look forward to an interesting exchange with participants today. Like my fellow panelists, I would like to challenge some of the assumptions that are in the introduction to this panel, and fundamentally I would challenge the approach that compartmentalizes political, economic, development affairs on one side with human rights at the other end of the spectrum, in favor of adopting a human rights-based approach. And I would also like to look at some elements at the practical level of good practice and maybe less good practice. So let me start by challenging one of the assumptions that human rights are ideals and just ideals. Absolutely agree that human rights are ideals, they're values, they're principles, but in fact they're much more than that. They can start as ideals, but what we've seen for the last 60 years is that these ideals have been translated into entitlements and obligations that are legally binding. Like them or not, states are actually bound to uphold them, and at a minimum, we're looking at the obligation to uphold all of the human rights set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether they be economic, social, cultural, or civil and political. Beyond that, almost without exception, countries have ratified and chosen to be bound by certain international human rights treaties, whether it's on the rights of the child, against racial discrimination, against discrimination against women, covenant on civil and political rights, or economic, social, cultural rights, and that means that they're legally bound to implement them in law and practice, and to submit periodic reports on how they're actually implementing them. Of course, we know that that actually doesn't necessarily translate into progress on the ground where it matters. That takes time, it takes resources, it takes political will, and it takes member states to act in partnership with many other stakeholders. But the fundamental issue that I wanted to underscore here is that there is a clear legal framework, that of international human rights law, that underpins or should underpin policy and practice. And this is important, not the least, because it means that there's one standard for all, and that it is somewhat removed from the political arena. And this is particularly the case for these international human rights treaties, whose implementation is monitored by the human rights treaty bodies, composed of independent experts. So this is not an intergovernmental mechanism. So I would argue that this gives the diplomatic community and foreign affairs ministries really, it means that they're ideally placed to reinforce the principle as much as the practice that human rights are legal obligations under international human rights law, and that actually respecting them is neither negotiable nor discretionary. Secondly, Is it true that political economic development interests are free from a legal or regulatory framework, which the introduction would lead to that assumption? Here I would say that just as human rights situations evolve, we can never be static, so must UN human rights standards and instruments. Common assumption is that while the state may be bound by certain obligations towards human rights, well, business is another affair entirely and we can't do anything about that. Well, no one can argue that this isn't among today's very pressing challenges. But the frameworks now exist in these areas too. And just to give one example, the guiding principles on business and human rights. So if after the last 60 years of developing the legal human rights framework, we still have a way to go before we're seeing implementation on the ground and the full enjoyment of human rights, it's maybe a little premature to expect that the guiding principles, which were adopted only in 2011, to really have made their impact fully felt. But at least this is the groundwork that's already been done for us. And if we recognize that the main challenge is implementation, then I think as human rights actors, we see here an opportunity as well as a challenge to make more efforts to speak a language that resonates with the decision makers in different fields, including the business field. So we're looking here about business interlocutors speaking to other business interlocutors, among others. And I do think that it's encouraging to find that there is a very high level of interest in the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights, and not just among governments and business, but among all the stakeholders that you could reasonably expect. Multinational corporations, sure. Technology, mining industries, absolutely. Civil society, of course, have a home here. But particularly, I would say, important is representatives of indigenous communities whose lives may have been dramatically affected by extractive industries operating on their traditional land. The first meeting of this forum was just 1 year ago, and for a very new initiative, it attracted more than 1,000 participants from 85 countries. The second one is due to take place just in a couple of weeks' time. So we recognize there's a long way to go. There's much to be done in creating awareness of the guiding principles, encourage engagement with the forum and with the associated working group. And there's a role here for governments and civil society, I think, in promoting their use by governments and by business alike, and by encouraging affected civil society to also engage with these initiatives. The third assumption that I want to challenge here is that, as others have before me, that human rights and political, economic, and development interests are incompatible. Well, what would you expect me to say? No, of course they're not. Although we know that in the minds of many that remains the case, and that many will prefer to say, well, let's keep human rights locked away in their marginalized home and only open the box when we're ready to do that, and maybe not for very long. The Global Compact, which was launched back in 2000, is already a powerful illustration of the business case for human rights in the positive sense, of the meaning. The case for adopting a human rights-based approach is all the more compelling when we see what happens when it's not adopted. Non-respect of human rights can result in staggering economic losses, stagnation, political, social unrest, fragmented societies, and too often conflict. To state the obvious, then human rights are integral to economic development, which is not just for the benefit of some. Endeavours by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and many others to put human rights at the centre of the debate around the Millennium Development Goals and the post-2015 agenda, to encourage adoption of the human rights-based approach must continue. Because if an individual is poor, economically disempowered, then she or he is disempowered in virtually almost all other areas of human rights, whether it's access to health, education, justice, participation in public life, and so on. And where does that leave us? Well, looking specifically at the international arena, I'd like to just refer to some positive cases of leading by example. We've seen at the level of the Human Rights Council a number of initiatives on thematic and country situations which have involved cross-regional sponsors. And this has been important not just to affirm the capacity of the Human Rights Council to take action on diverse human rights issues, but the readiness by member states in all geographic regions to support robust resolutions on issues that are sometimes pretty tough ones. And just to cite a couple of examples, look at thematic resolutions on trafficking, especially women and children, sponsored by the Philippines and Germany. The human rights of persons with disability, Mexico and New Zealand. Internally displaced persons, Austria and Uganda. Disappearances, France, Argentina, Morocco. Human rights, sexual orientation and gender identity, South Africa and Brazil. And I would actually like to highlight here the positive role that Ireland adopted in introducing a resolution along with Japan, Tunisia, Chile, and Sierra Leone on the importance of civil society space. This trend, I would argue, is a great opportunity to strengthen human rights dialogue, in particular among states that initiate and co-sponsor resolutions, and resolutions that are consequently adopted by consensus. It gives an important signal. We can see that to have such forward-looking resolutions adopted by consensus does imply, again, a recognition of obligations by member states to uphold their human rights commitments, and a further basis on which bilateral relationships and conversations can be built. Here I would say we're talking less in terms of angels and devils, those that have traditionally embraced or not human rights, but really among states that have different perspectives, but can actually come together with a common cause. Again, leading by example, and I'll be brief, it's important to recognize the EU guidelines on human rights defenders, both practical and forward-looking. And this is just one among many other examples I could cite, but of course there are always areas where leadership can be strengthened. I think it's interesting that so far we are waiting for EU member states to ratify the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and members of their families. Ratification wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would be a step in the right direction and further strengthen the EU's role in international human rights scene. So strong standards at the international level, coupled with cross-regional initiatives, can really assist in advancing the human rights agenda. Naturally, it's important that if states are outspoken at the international level, it's quite important to have that matched with action at home. Increasingly, just looking at within Europe, we see the rise of xenophobia, hate speech, marginalization of minorities, including Roma, hostility towards migrants, exacerbated certainly by the downturn in economies. So states that are outspoken in the international level can expect the scrutiny to be greater on how the contemporary challenges, such as the ones I've just mentioned, are addressed within a human rights framework at the national level. I'm concluding here with a few words about civil society. I'm chief of the civil society section at the OHCHR, so I can't not mention that. So you will understand why I think it's really important that states really prioritize civil society in terms of reality checks, litmus tests, that in the development of foreign policy, they should take into account first the aspirations of diverse civil society actors on the ground, and obviously not just those that agree with us or speak the same language, but really try to engage with the true diversity. And second, that they truly be guided by the existence or the lack of public freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, expression, and the space for civil society in which to operate, because without that, there is no civil society. I thank you for your patience, and I look forward very much to the upcoming panel's deliberations on these and other issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist this morning is Dr. Stephen Humphreys, who is Senior Lecturer in International Law at London School of Economics and Political Science. He previously held senior roles at the International Council on Human Rights Policy and the Open Society Justice Initiative. He has conducted policy work on climate change and in human rights in a variety of fora. His research interests include rule of law, law and development, and climate change. Dr. Humphreys, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thanks to the department for the opportunity to address you today. It's a real pleasure for me to be speaking in the city. So this morning I want to talk to you about a subject that I've been working on for some years, as the Ambassador mentioned, climate change. This is an area in which human rights and foreign policy, I think, often appear to be at loggerheads at first glance. And I'll say more about that in a moment. What I'll eventually be suggesting, though, is that despite first appearances, a climate-sensitive foreign policy is not only in sync with a strong human rights policy, it is indispensable to it. For human rights, what we will need ultimately are carbon-neutral trade policies and a commitment to a global treaty. But the first point I want to make, one cannot speak about foreign policy, obviously, without in the abstract. It means different things at different times in different countries. In the Maldives, for example, there's long been a primary foreign policy objective of promoting recognition of the human rights dimensions of climate change. But they've done so for the most traditional of foreign policy rationales, national security. For the Maldives face a threat, an existential threat from climate change. The islands are already sinking. So alerting the world to human rights consequences of climate change is, for the Maldives, a matter of life and death. Still, this policy has brought them into some tension with some of the heavyweights in the international community. And this probably won't surprise us. If we look closely at the foreign and development policies of many of the more powerful countries, they don't bear much scrutiny from the perspective of what we might call climate justice. So if we just throw our eye over the international policy scene, I think this is what we find. We find foreign policies that are not in sync, that are at root propelling climate change forward despite much rhetoric otherwise. To take a very obvious and maybe extreme example, the Iraq war may or may not have been fought over oil. But one thing that is sure is that the armies that were involved were clearly keen to get the oil flowing again, well before the fighting had stopped. This was 10 years after the Rio Agreement to curb climate change internationally. So when we think about the human cost of resource wars like the Iraq War, it is easy to forget to factor in the broader costs, the human costs of our ongoing oil addiction. And what a cost it is. You don't need me to remind you of the horsemen of the apocalypse climate change scenarios. Irish Aid, I notice, is in their most recent development report, annual report, shows a profound awareness of the degree to which climate change is already impacting communities around the world. This is manifest in increasing vulnerability to food shocks, water shocks, commodity price spikes, and of course rising seas, droughts, increasing intensity of hurricanes. Just last week we had a chilling example of what this means in practice, or what it may mean in practice in the Philippines. It's a case of real problems in real places, to use the language of Ambassador Baer a moment ago. I'm an international lawyer, so I view foreign policy through the lens of international law. Some will explain international law as solving coordination problems. The purpose of international law is to solve coordination problems for states. The idea is that once general broad goals have been established, states may align their policies in the knowledge that in doing so they will not be struggling against the current. As we know, and as Jim Ray pointed out, international law does not place countries under a strong obligation to deliver human rights in their foreign policies, but it clearly encourages and supports them in doing so. All states have in principle agreed to basic human rights standards. This provides a language of leverage from push comes to shove. This is also true in other areas of international law. In trade policy, it is true when states go to war. There are rules in every case. We all know what we're supposed to be doing. We know what the rules are. Maybe we don't always do it. The system works patchy at best, but at least there is one. When it comes to climate change, however, this is no longer the case. As we know, there isn't an international agreement despite over 20 years of negotiation. The result is that the states wish to continue drilling for oil if they wish to maintain high carbon economies and promoting them either through their domestic or foreign policies. There's very little to stop them doing so. There's no level playing field. And states do continue to do so. According to the World Bank, to this day, there's over $600 billion in subsidies every year spent on the oil and gas industries. Much of this money is in support of foreign investment. Ironically, countries might hang their entire economies on fossil fuel extraction and still claim to be leaders in climate change. This is the case in Norway. Norway is making a bid to be carbon neutral by 2030. It's a world leader on climate change. Part of its plan is to invest heavily in forests in Indonesia. But here's a rub. Norway can only achieve climate neutrality if it offsets only those carbon emissions that are located in Norway itself. It doesn't include carbon emissions stemming from the oil and gas that's extracted in Norway and Norwegian waters and then exported to the rest of the world. The problem is that Norwegian exports of fossil fuels contribute more than 10 times as much to global warming as Norway's own domestic use of carbon. Norway can claim under international law that this is not Norway's problem, it's somebody else's problem. Whoever imports the oil and gas is responsible for the emissions. But what a problem it is. Already in Norway, changing climate is destroying the way of life of indigenous reindeer herders. And of course, we know that the human rights effects are far more profound in other parts of the world, in particular in the developing world, where the storms are wilder, the droughts last longer, the water is scarcer, and the people are much more vulnerable to waves of climate destruction. So Norway's policy is disingenuous and short-sighted. But the point I want to make is that disingenuous and short-sightedness is in fact typical of most countries today when faced with the causes and consequences of climate change. The thing is that because climate change is a global economy, a global phenomenon, it cannot be addressed by domestic policies alone. Carbon emissions are embedded in the DNA of the international trade system, of the global economy. We export our own emissions. We import emissions that are produced elsewhere. The global economy swills carbon around through the millions of products traversing the world every day. So it has long been clear that any country that is serious about climate change and about the human rights consequences it brings must bring carbon neutral standards into their trade policy. They must impose low or no carbon standards on imports and exports. Let's call this a carbon neutral trade policy. If we are to address climate change and head off its human rights consequences, a carbon neutral trade policy is not a luxury, it's a necessity in the long term. Of course, any such policy would need to be accompanied by efforts to bring other countries on board. Here too, we cannot do without the coordination that comes from bringing an international climate change treaty into being. But in the meantime, some countries are better than others to take the lead. It helps, for example, to have little or no dependence on fossil fuels in your economy. So my modest suggestion today would be perhaps that Ireland could consider showing leadership in this area too. Ireland's already a leader, in fact, in climate change policy, in its climate change action, in its development policy. Why not think about introducing it also into trade policy? To do so would be consistent with a strong commitment to human rights and with a long-term vision of the national interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for what I think has been a very interesting introduction to our hopefully stimulating discussion, which I hope will follow. So now we come to the interaction between yourselves and hopefully and the panel. And so I'd like to open the floor and to ask anybody who'd like to take the floor to first of all introduce themselves. And thank you very much. So, first hand I see up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is José Antonio Gutierrez. My name is José Antonio Gutierrez. I'm from the Latin American Solidarity Center. There's a lot of food for thought. So thanks very much for putting all this together. And something that resonated was what Ambassador O'Brien was saying about human rights being increasingly the language of foreign policy. And I'm starting to wonder if that's necessarily, probably this is going to be very, very theoretical, if that's necessarily a good thing in a world that's so uneven in terms of power. Why I say that? Because in a world that's so uneven in terms of power, we've seen that, for instance, the rebellion in Libya or Syria is kind of okay when in Colombia it's not. Freedom of expression is okay when it's about a private channel in Venezuela or about the internet in China, but then WikiLeaks is a different thing. Then we talk about how terrible the situation of Kurds is in Iraq, but then in Turkey it's not so bad, and you can't talk about that. There are butchers on one side, freedom fighters on another. And I don't want to talk about double standards, as Dr. Sims was saying. But what I want to ask is to what extent, and I do agree with Jim Ray, human rights should be far more than ideal, but they should be also far more than language. It should be far more than discourse. So I just think to what extent the discourse of human rights can actually conceal the ugly politics of an uneven world. And we can be increasingly using it as a wrapping for other political agendas that can actually conceal what's going on the stage. Human rights alone don't explain why we have a different position in relation to different courts, why we have a different position if we talk about expression of different people, freedom of expression of different people. So to what extent human rights can be a discourse to wrap up politics?
Thank you. Good, great.
I have a feeling that I'm at least part of the target of that question, and maybe at the center of it. You know, I mean, I think, yes, international politics goes on, and while I take issue with some of your characterizations, I think part of what Ambassador O'Brien said is actually a broader statement about where we are historically, and there's no question that what started as an international political project less than 70 years ago has by any measure been remarkably successful. I mean, it's actually quite astounding how the idea of international human rights started so recently, and that today all governments, including my own, and this is where I would say, you know, you brought up several incidents where you said, we talk about it in this case, but not in that case. I completely reject that. There are plenty of people who are talking about human rights with respect to the US government right now. And my government is responding based on that conversation. And so the language does have power over even the most powerful government in the world. And I think it's quite amazing that it is through the hard work over not that many decades of people that this has become a language of power in global politics, and that repressive regimes, even if they say they don't agree with human rights standards, seek to justify their repression and their authority with reference to this international human rights language, and that democratic regimes that are imperfect as any democratic government will be, use the language of human rights to both respond to their critics and accept the language of the human rights from their critics, and as a recipe for how to reform and make themselves better. So I think the point that Ambassador O'Brien made is quite an important one, and I think it's important for us to recognize that it wasn't a given 70 years ago when Eleanor Roosevelt and others drafted the Universal Declaration, that the Universal Declaration would be so, would have flowered as much as it has into so many very real measures, including where very powerful, serious states come together and detail their record to other states and to committees of experts and receive criticism and go through all. I mean, it's quite astounding how successful it is.
If I may indulge myself, since I was mentioned as a moderator, I open to do this, but if I may very briefly, just to say two things on this. One is that an inconsistency of application is really not a reason to negate the value of the progression of human rights. And just to add from my own experience, how astonished I am and continue to be about one aspect of human rights, which is accountability and enforceability of accountability for grave violations of human rights, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. When we think of the fact that it's only in the last 20 years that we have international accountability mechanisms, that the ICTY and the ICTR for Rwanda, ICTY for former Yugoslavia, were only set up in the early 1990s. And we think this was the first time that there was such a concept of international justice after Nuremberg. That's an awfully long time, and an awful lot of things had happened during that time where there were no accountability mechanisms. So I think we do have to bear in mind the relative youth of what we're talking about and give it a chance, and also accepting that there is inconsistency of application, but that we as a community need to be careful not to allow that to become part of the dialogue. Thank you. Sorry. Any other response to the balance? Yes?
Just very briefly, thank you for the question, and I think your message is very clear for us all. There's no room for complacency, and that's for sure. I would just also say in support of what Ambassador O'Brien has just said, the human rights framework, the accountability framework, is still in progress, and on the other hand, we have to say we've come an incredibly long way. I started my human rights career more than 30 years ago, and it was very easy for member states simply to ignore human rights and just turn off listening when human rights were approached. And that is very, very far from being the case. We have now so many options open to us, whether it's at the international level or regional level, national level. There are mechanisms to hold governments to account for their human rights record. And again, I would say that the international framework has come a long way, is still maturing. But if we're looking at one of the most recent mechanisms, the Universal Periodic Review, and I would urge that that be seen together with the other parts of the human rights program. This is a mechanism that looks at the human rights record of every single member state, and every single member state has engaged with it. We're now into the second cycle, 4.5-year cycle of that, and what it provides is actually one more vehicle for us to use and to take us away from the double standards, but actually to use that opportunity to call all of the member states to account for all of the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, very quickly. So it was interesting to me that everybody on the panel agrees, apparently, that human rights and foreign policy work together. When we all see around us every day in the news that this can't quite be true. I think there's a very obvious point that human rights are part of the foreign policy arsenal. It's used as a foreign policy tool when it suits states to do so. So we saw that in Europe during the decolonization period. We saw it with the US coming towards the end of the Cold War and immediately afterwards. This is a great way to get your national interest across. But it does mean that when we align government policy with human rights, it's only certain human rights at certain times in certain places that we really care about. And so it seems to me that for NGOs, for civil society, the real point is to remind us about all those other human rights that are being ignored as states claim to be on the side of human rights. And that applies for every state.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Hussein Bankat. I'm with the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights in Cairo. My question really builds on the very last comments made by Mr. Humphreys. It's a friendly question, but from a practitioner's point of view, you would all be classified as, in foreign policy circles, maybe as the idealists as opposed to the realists. In even your own departments, we engage many Ministries of Foreign Affairs, but also missions back home and in multilateral fora, and we make this classification as well. We, of course, know who is an ally on our issues that we can reach out to, and who would be more difficult to sell our issues to. And we realize that this is also the case even within your own department. So one of the most memorable quotes that I remember was in 2011, after the Egypt and Tunisia, and the heartfelt and overwhelming support that we received, and then Bahrain happened, and Bahrain received a very different reaction from the United States in particular. And I remember the New York Times put that question to a senior White House official at the time, not to name names, but Dennis McDonald. And his answer was, we do not make these decisions based on precedent, and we do not make these decisions based on consistency. And I have taken this, I always remind myself of this quote, because this would make him obviously a realist, but this is very helpful actually to me, to have someone say this, and I wish there was someone on the panel today who represented the view that no, they're not compatible, and most often we do not apply them persistently or consistently, and not based on precedent. So the friendly question really is, my view is that it is not a question of a conflict between ideals and interests. It is a conflict about how we define interests, how you define interests. Because we can make the point, as you all made this morning, that it is if you want stability, you cannot support these repressive regimes. But obviously, the capital I idealists will say, no, that these are, we have a different view to our interests. So, 2 points here really, and these are the questions. One is, we know that most of the time it is the Dennis McDonald's that prevail. And not all the time, but in these, when decisions are made, it is these idealists that prevail. How do you manage this complicated relationship in your own decision-making circles? But then what a human rights advocate can do or should do to really influence those difficult nuts to crack? Because we will always go to democracy, rights, and labor colleagues, and they will always agree with us on most issues. Not Palestine, but on most issues. But it's really not there that we face the most difficulty when the decisions are made. It's with the other departments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody in the panel like to respond? This is largely by way of comment. Very interesting comment, but maybe we'll move on then to the next question, and I'm sure there'll be responses that address some of the issues raised. Thank you very much. Yes, your hand there, yes. Thank you.
I'd like to, I'm Andrew Anderson from Frontline Defenders. I'd like to respond partly to Hassan. I think one of the challenges is who we define as realists and who we define as idealists. Is it realistic that we have Saudi Arabia now in the Human Rights Council? Is it realistic that we are supporting, or many of the Western countries are supporting a regime in Saudi Arabia that is institutionalized misogyny, that is exporting political violence to the rest of the world, that's repressing religious minorities, migrant workers, most of the citizens of Saudi Arabia, which invaded Bahrain to repress a movement for human rights and democracy in Bahrain, and yet the so-called realists say that we've got to work with the regime in Saudi Arabia and that we can't criticise it. And it's maybe the exception to the rule that most countries now get criticised in terms of their human rights record. It's the great sort of black hole of human rights criticism in terms of international relations, and it's now going to be sitting on the Human Rights Council to help us move human rights forward. I think we need to challenge the idea of who are the idealists and who are the realists. It's not realistic to be putting our eggs in the Saudi Arabian basket. It's the so-called realists who got it wrong in Tunisia and in Egypt. And we need to be stronger in terms of affirming that those who are working for human rights are actually quite realistic. And I think, just by way of concluding, I'd like to also say that I particularly appreciated the focus Ambassador Baer gave to thinking not just about governments, but about peoples. And human rights belong to all of us, including the people in Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Sims will comment on this.
Thank you very briefly, because I didn't actually respond to Hassan's point, but in the sense it's since been amplified, because I'm not a Middle Eastern expert, but it seems to me that's an exact illustration of the point I was trying to make in my own remarks about realism not being realistic, which you've also picked up on. And the specific issue, I think, with regard to Bahrain is that we are indeed putting our eggs, I speak naturally from a Western viewpoint, putting our eggs in one basket. And so the result is not just in Bahrain, but in the entire Gulf region. We are pushing Shiite populations into the arms of Iran. We are creating for ourselves a strategic problem through being blindsided on human rights. So that's, I think, another example of the way in which the two are compatible, ought to be compatible. But my critique of current policy is, and here I would agree even with the first question, is that they aren't always in sync, but they should be.
Thank you. That's right.
Real quick on two things. One, this is an unmixed thought, and Professor Sims is very generous to assume that because he's not an expert in something, he shouldn't comment, and I won't give you that caveat. But one of the things I've been thinking about lately, there was a lot of talk several years ago, really, about the fact that quarterly earnings reports for corporations was causing a change in the way that business leaders made decisions to the detriment of long-term strategy for corporations. And I think there's an analog to that in foreign policy. And I think part of the tension that we're raising up when we say idealists or realists, we're really talking about timelines in some sense. And that's what I meant when I said, the strategy is clear. It's a disagreement over tactics. And my answer to you in terms of inside our own government, I think it's not fair to either camp. I certainly don't want to be painted as somebody who doesn't care about the interests of my country, or is naive about the short term or whatever. I don't think my colleagues who I find myself disagreeing with on tactical questions are disregarding the long-term strategy. Our president has laid out very clearly that human rights is part of our national security strategy. and I think they're loyal to that vision. I think there are disagreements with factors. I think that the engagement with civil society is something that, including public statements by civil society, always forces a more careful examination of the long term, and so I think that's incredibly useful. But I just think there's an analog there. When you have structural incentives, which are very real, to measure things in, will this go wrong in next week, 1 month, 3 months, it makes it very hard. You have to balance that with people who are saying, now think about 10 years. And that's, I think, part of what you see play out in these discussions, without commenting on the specific discussion that you raised. On the Human Rights Council point, I think it's a really important one, and I would like to make a public plea, which is, I think one of the things that citizens of European countries could do is ask their governments not to trade votes for the Human Rights Council elections. Because we will never get a Human Rights Council membership that reflects Human Rights Council, reflects human rights leadership if all of the human rights leaders in the world have traded away their votes, including to those who don't represent human rights leadership. And the United States does not trade votes, and several other countries do not trade votes, but a lot of countries do. And it makes it impossible for them to then take a principled stand on these elections. It makes it impossible for them to encourage competitive elections. I mean, part of the problem is that, you know, the last competitive election was when the United States and Ireland and Sweden and Germany and Greece were running together, which is, you know, that's a competitive election, but in other regions of the world there isn't one, and there won't be one until there's until there's a degree of shame attached to vote trading, because vote trading does not make it an election; it makes it a gangster's game. So that would be one practical suggestion that that European citizens can make to their governments.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. I'll take it.
Thank you. I can see that it might not be easy to be a panelist, and sorry that we have to target you with those questions coming from nowhere. I want to bring the question at a very strategic level and technical level, and I can see that anyone asking the question bring it back to his own situation in his own country. I'm here from the Federal Foundation for Human Rights in Ivory Coast. We have a very big issue there, but I'll also talk about Congo. In Ivory Coast particularly, my questions come from what the lady that said, that there's so many mechanisms and ways to help a particular government accountable when it comes to human rights. And I definitely agree with that. We understand that countries have their own interest in a particular strategic interest in a particular country, which might seem that from a civil person as I am, a particular government can be protected from unveiling a human rights issue in its own country. We have a president, Alassane Ouattara, who is very loved by the international community. This is how we see it. And we don't reject that. That's fine. This is own communication. But there's 800 political prisoners that are held in jail. One was the head of what Ireland calls SIPTU, the union. He was freed by the government that said there were nothing against him. 2 months later, he died from the result of torture. And last week, another one died. So they are in jail, and there's no charge. The main thing is they represent a danger for national security, but there's no judgment, there's nothing. We have an ambassador of the United States, of France, they're all aware. We are not saying that this president is not good, but those prisoners, at least as there are so many ways to have them accountable, is there any little gesture that is made to tell the president, please free these guys or judge them and sentence them the way you want? Just these basic things. The second country which I really love is DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Every hour, 48 women are raped in Congo. We know it. It's not hidden. We have been here for 3 hours, almost 2 hours, and you can calculate how many women are going through this process. There's a lot of economic interest in Congo. We are all aware of that. But just human, like you and me, human rights, especially women. And when I say women, it's not adults only. It's old women, it's children, it's any woman who could be your mother, my mother. If there's so many ways to hold the government accountable, but not only governments, but rebels, because in North Kivu, we have all those rebels that are doing things that we all know, we are all aware. If I was able to find out, it means that American diplomatic or anybody else is aware of that. So what do we, or what do you do for these women that are going to be raped and raped every day? That's a little action to reduce it or to put some pressures on the rebels or on the government, or at least help the government for this to not happen. Do you have any way of mainstreaming the issue for particularly this point, telling them, oh, well, please reduce raping if we cannot stop you, but please reduce that in this particular country? Thank you.
Real quickly, because I know we want to have time for more questions. On Côte d'Ivoire, I went there shortly after the crisis, and the Justice Ministry had been completely looted. There were 2 computers in the entire Ministry of Justice at the time, and one of the things that I talked about with the government was the need to rebuild the Justice Ministry quickly to be able to deliver rule of law in an even-handed way. So yes, absolutely, we send the message that that part of recovering from a conflict is being credible in the way that justice is administered, and it is both a practical and a political challenge. It was stunning how much had been destroyed. It is a practical challenge to rebuild that, and a political challenge to rebuild that as well. And certainly that is part of the objective of Côte d'Ivoire and part of the messaging, I assume, from a range of governments, not just my own, but certainly it was part of and I went out and visited the West and delivered the same message in Man and other places in the country. In Congo, I think obviously the international community has not succeeded in ending, in helping to support an end to what has been way too many years, decades of ongoing horrors in the Great Lakes region. And that doesn't mean that there haven't been efforts to apply pressure. And I think some successful efforts in the sense that they have applied more pressure. There have been pressure on regional leaders. There's been pressure on the rebel groups. The action of the UN Security Council, Secretary Clinton made a priority of condemning rape as a weapon of war. Prime Minister Cameron has made that a flagship of his foreign policy right now within the G8. So there are a number of examples of international leaders trying to shine a spotlight on the ongoing problem. The problem is ongoing, and I think that's a really, really tough one. And the way that we will find solutions is both by continuing to push accountability of the leaders in the region and continuing to support positive steps that they take to help deliver accountability in governments, including in the Eastern Congo.
If I may, I don't think we can finish this conversation without mentioning the value that the United Nations brings. Of course, in Congo, the frustration that it has to bear, that the United Nations, both in Côte d'Ivoire and its focus on the building of the infrastructure and the development of rule of law is a key issue since Ouattara went into power. And this is something that they're very sensitive to. Obviously, Rome isn't going to be built in a day, but we have to hope that this will improve. And also in the DRC, I should mention that the Security Council resolutions in relation to MONUSCO have been very clear, and for the first time in the history of the Security Council are really highlighting and profiling in those particular resolutions human rights and international humanitarian law. So I think that's something that's of value. I'd like to go right back to the back of the room, just because I think I've sort of forgotten a little bit down there. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank
Chairperson, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I arrived a bit late, so perhaps this has been totally discussed before I